Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's a great pleasure. Welcome back to today's program, Gary Barraco, who's Senior Director, Product Marketing at E2Open. And today we're going to talk about how compliant is your supply chain, why you should conduct a trade compliance self-audit. So as we all know, supply chain is a very complex system for companies across every industry out there. And one of the most complex parts of that system is global trade management and trade compliance. And none of it is getting any easier either. So what's changed or different today with trade compliance? Why is conducting a self-audit important? And what's involved with the self-audit and how do you get started? Well, those are the main questions we're going to discuss in today's episode. And it's great to welcome Gary back to the program to share his insights and advice on this topic. So Gary, welcome to the program.
It's always good for us to share our office space together virtually.
Exactly. And it's looking great. Nice and tidy. If you were to see my desk, not as tidy as yours, but anyway, it gives me something to do every Friday afternoon. It's my OCD kicking, a little bit of my OCD kicking in to then pick up all that mess. So
great.
So let's get right to the topic. As I just said right now, I mean, global trade management, trade compliance in particular, has always been, important. It's always been a bit challenging. But is it more so today? I mean, what's different or changed?
I keep telling myself how much more work do supply chain professionals these days have on their plates than before, right? Before what? Well, pre-pandemic, obviously, China trade wars, right? So we know that we kind of have these historical markers of where supply chain started tumbling and how folks are trying to keep them held up and moving and right. I was shopping last night and I looked in the one aisle and all of the shelves were empty. Again, this morning at the grocery store, more empty shelves. And so trade compliance professionals are just under so much pressure because they're the folks that have to ensure the goods are going to cross the border when they finally get here, right? And it's just more difficult because of all of these unexpected trade disruptions, but also changing regulations. Right now we see, I did a webinar at the beginning of the year and I foretold that we would see more regulatory controls around the world, and that's coming through. Customs authorities are really signaling a stricter stance and putting companies of all sizes at higher risk for an audit. And while we're so busy, supply chain professionals say, I don't have time to stop and do a self-audit and check myself. I just need to keep going because there's not enough hours in a day. But with the increasing number of audits that are either being conducted or scheduling, plus the intensified penalties and the costs that come with it, it's really essential that you're staying on your toes. Take the time to check to see that things are operating. And we'll talk more about how we can break that up. But we are seeing a definitive increase in enforcement actions. Customs organizations all around the globe have been more and more explicit about their intent to audit every exporter and importer at some point in time. So it's better to be ready for that audit. In particular, U.S. government agencies have really set the high bar for due diligence practices and describing their compliance expectations in settlement agreements that companies that have been less than diligent. So if you go to the BIS or the OFAC websites, you could see, well, what was the settlement that company had to agree to with the U.S. government, and a lot of that is heightened due diligence practices. We've also seen sanctions and export control enforcement in the United Kingdom, so it's not just the U.S. Primarily, we're seeing China, U.S., U.K., and EU. But that's not to say other countries aren't going to do the same. It's been a significant change. The UK officials have emphasized more investigative work and higher penalties. We're seeing them so far more detailed in their analysis, and they're really pushing to having more face-to-face meetings to kind of test the facts and explanations in a way that they didn't previously. So a combination of things again, turbulent trade environment, trying to push goods across borders quickly, and government actions increasing.
A lot of great, points there. And, as you were talking, you mentioned, we see it in the newspapers every day, right? You talk about port congestion, you're talking about, difficulties in getting different supplies. We're seeing that in the automotive sector, for example. So it's one thing to say, hey, well, why don't we just shift suppliers or shift, where we import from this country to this country, and, aside from the logistics challenges, it's not that simple because, whenever you're going to shift from one country to another, if you're going to import from somewhere else, you're going to be subjected to whatever the trade compliance requirements are for that particular trade lane or that particular cross-border movement. And as you just talked about right now, the things are just getting more complex. Audits and regulations are changing all the time. And so that just adds to the complexity of supply chain, executives have. It's not just as easy as saying, okay, we're just going to import from a different country than for a different supplier to a different country, because that has all sorts of ripple effect ramifications where trade compliance comes in, right?
To that point, Adrian, we're not really seeing that with the finished good factory production facilities. We're seeing a lot of that with the raw materials and component suppliers, right? And so that end tier level of access and visibility to those suppliers, right? We're seeing a lot of the microchip suppliers. I just posted a blog about soybeans the other day. So, all of the components that are going into products, or even the soybeans that are providing animal feed to the hog farmers in China, need to cross a border. And so as we look at all of the details within every component, we need to look at that and say, yeah, it's not that easy to just shift and say, let's go get our raw materials and components over here now. So that requires more work, more due diligence.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we tend to focus a lot on that finished goods outbound supply chain, but the inbound side, is arguably, so much more, in many ways, so much more complex. So, you can't forget about the inbound side too.
Right.
You talked about audit and kind of the, the increases in audits. And when people hear the word audit, I mean, that usually scares people, right? But audits are not just about trying to uncover, some wrongdoing. I think, as you alluded to, that, they're also a way to kind of uncover opportunities for improvement and to prevent some, compliance issues down the road, which is, I guess, where self audits come in. So kind of taking a step back a little bit. I mean, you already referenced it. I mean, what do you mean by a self audit? What activities are involved in it, and how does it differ from an official customs audit?
Yeah, I remember when I was younger, and there was always the IRS is going to audit your taxes, right? And now when I do my own taxes online, and you when you use these tools from the other provider, you can actually buy insurance. Well, we'll be there if you get audited, but audit isn't a negative response in this, really. Even though that probing nature aggravates companies, audits are more of a quest to discover corruption and negligence. So if your company doesn't have corruption or negligence, what it's really going to do is to gather data on your company and evaluate the likelihood of non-compliance. It's kind of a preemptive measure, and especially that self-audit. Companies should regularly conduct internal assessments and self-audits, and maybe we don't call them audits and we call them assessments. And that kind of demonstrates the level of satisfactory due diligence that you're doing. Also, when customs authorities call for phone interviews or face-to-face interviews, and you tell them we do self audits every quarter, and this is how we follow through. That's a level of due diligence that they want to hear and see in your organization. But really, what happens is, you're looking at all of your applicable trade control regulations for all import and export transactions and restricted party screening, trade agreement qualification. By doing this assessment, there's two primary activities. The first is that soft data, and I'll talk about each. And the second is the hard data, right? So, without going through this exhaustive, manually extensive exercise that scrutinize every transaction, do conduct some personal interviews with your teams, with your client, your compliance stakeholders, with your suppliers, and examine the processes and procedures that they use. And that kind of harvests that soft data, right? And this could be a third party within your own organization or someone on your compliance team that, you're doing the self-check this quarter, and go around and interview folks and say, what is your process when you bring on a new supplier, for instance, right? And how do we do compliance checks on new customers, et cetera, right? And let's review one or two transactions. It could be something that simple that could discover a fault within your process, and that can be corrected before the big guys even come knocking on the door. Looking at your documentation, running analysis. The self-audit establishes kind of this quantified error ratio and exposes those faults before potential violation.
Yeah, no, it sounds like anything else. I mean, the last thing you want to do is to, come upon an official audit and all your answers are, well, I don't know. I don't know how we do that, or we've never done that before, or let me see who I can get to answer that question. Like anything else, you always want to be prepared, and the more you understand what your processes are, again, it's just greater opportunities to find those opportunities for improvement and to correct issues, while they are not really a big issue, but to correct them before they become something bigger or more pervasive, across the organization. I would assume that maybe, large and small companies, this would be, very helpful for. Obviously, the larger companies have more complex processes, more moving parts, and so forth. But, in my experience, even large companies historically have viewed global trade management, trade compliance as, just paperwork, something that, didn't rise to the same level of importance as, some other aspects of supply chain management, although that needle has started to move, thankfully, in the past few years. But if a company is relatively new to all this, I mean, how do they get started? I mean, what's a good starting point?
Well, whether you're new to this, whether your organization's growing and you've got higher risk levels because you're expanding your country footprint for sourcing, if you're doing direct sourcing with raw materials. But then on the other side, we have to understand that the compliance processes are not just for purchasing and moving goods that you're producing and bringing to market. These transactions go across the entire organization, right? And they're transactions for that reason. So who are you selling to? Are you screening who you're selling to as well? Who are you procuring internal resources for? So, your offices are buying tons of paper and computers, and are you screening the folks that you're buying from? Because restricted party screening, denied party embargoes is getting bigger and bigger. So, take a look at your processes, review them, maybe schedule some refresher training for all of your stakeholders, both internal and external. Of course, the self-audit is a good starting point. What we're launching here at E2Open, though, is a self-check, a 11-question, very quick self-check that may give you a good indication. It's only going to provide a snapshot view of your organization's level of complete readiness. It's going to be an online survey that's 11 questions. It's a very simple yes or no answer. So the simple questionnaire isn't anything like an audit, but the results are really going to give you a high level of indicators that tell you whether your compliance processes are going to stand up or not. It took us a few years to develop this with a lot of input from customers and trade compliance professionals. And we've used it before, but only in a paper format at trade shows. And so what we've done now is put it online, and you can answer these 11 questions, yes or no. And at the end, it'll tell you whether you're at a high risk, at a low risk, or a medium risk. From there, we can help explore more options for you to strengthen your program.
So, with this online, survey or questionnaire you talked about, it has, 11 questions. I mean, what do these questions focus on? I mean, are there particular buckets or categories that the survey focuses on?
Yeah, to keep it simple, if we break it down into 4 areas, some of the questions revolve around cross-border processes, right? So simplifying your cross-border processes to ensure goods are flowing without delays. This could include documentation. How are your filing packets prepared? Are they less prone to error because of a certain methodology? And companies who direct file with government agencies can also reduce broker fees. So if that's something you want to do. So that's one, cross-border. Trade agreements, of course, important to reduce costs, especially as costs are escalating all around. Making optimal use of available trade agreements is a great way to reduce or eliminate your duty costs. But, folks are daunted by that because, it's difficult to go through the qualification process. But with trade automation tools, duties can be reduced. But there's a level of compliance risk with that. So we'll ask about that in our questionnaire. Sourcing decisions. We talked earlier about those inputs, right, that are coming in to make the finished goods. So what if scenarios? How do I determine, are you using what if scenarios to say, if I shift from this country to this country, do I have higher risk? Can I still qualify for a trade agreement? And what's the total landed cost? Additional tariffs and duties. So that's the third. And then fourth, there's all of these heightened controls for exports and dual use goods, increased regulations to safeguard against selling to bad actors, whether it be a financial transaction, legal, regulatory, or even operational. Supply chains need to focus on who is part of their customer base or their partner base. So I would say 4 areas: cross-border trade, trade agreements, sourcing decisions that change, and then the heightened export and restricted party controls.
Yeah, so those sound like, the 4 very meaty and important categories in this whole area. I didn't
Sure.
hear you talk about technology. So is technology part of the assessment, or are there questions companies should ask in terms of what technology capabilities or trade content capabilities they need to have to then help facilitate and automate and streamline some of these processes? I mean, where does technology fit into all of this?
Yeah, as a technology provider, we wanted to keep the self-check sort of agnostic and not say, oh, but if you leverage technology. So it's mainly looking at the processes, whether they be manual or using technology. So technology is not part of the self-check, but we know that it's essential in today's global trade scenario. Reducing manual audit preparation is also a piece of the puzzle. So in the E2Open technology, we have ways that you can either automate the audits or that happen automatically, right? We have digital audit trails that give full transparency for all of your ongoing and impromptu and pre-planned assessments. it's better for an organization to leverage automation to review their transactional data, right? We don't want to print out long reports and have to be matching things up. Those are the old days. No one can operate that way, especially with the volumes that we're moving. E2Open's trade compliance applications actually perform a lot of verification procedures that automate like a 2 or 3-way match, right? We're looking at the supplier's PO, the finished good PO, and we're looking at the source of the origins of those documents to ensure and who's on who we're working with. We're checking if the declarations match the order and invoice, right? And so this matching process can even extend to the warehouse receipt. So through this automatic screening process, we're eliminating kind of the first layer of risk. And then with access to the right information, you can also look at the duty programs that you're utilizing and ensuring that they still meet up. E2Open has capabilities in machine learning and artificial intelligence that can really help and improve your compliance overall. So providing the ability for companies to also self-audit and enable internal planners to kind of set up an audit plan is another piece of our software. So if you say, hey, we're going to run a quarterly self-audit, you can configure a set of reports and dashboards that the responsible auditor, whether internal or external, can run and then analyze and do your one-on-one interviews using that. So it's built in there.
Yeah. So, I mean, as you were going through that whole process, I mean, it's just further confirmation. I mean, up and down the supply chain. I mean, if you're still relying on spreadsheets, manual processes, print out, paper printouts, you're definitely in the laggard category, and
Yeah.
it's really going to become, almost impossible, to do any of this, particularly, when you look at, the amount of, products that companies have, particularly, with the bill of materials, let's say, or on the finished goods side, and then, just trying to track and do all the compliance aspects just from all those different parts and finished good products, it just becomes, virtually impossible to do, manually, or you'll need an army of thousands of people to,
Yes.
to do this. So like in so many other areas, technology certainly, plays an important role here to help streamline and facilitate and automate, some of these things. So Gary, as a way to wrap up then, I mean, so you take the self-audit or the self-assessment, let's call it an assessment. It's a little bit less scary of a term. I mean, what should companies do then with the results? I mean, what action should they take?
Well, I kind of envision that maybe a trade compliance leader would take the survey first, right? And do the self-check first. And then they would share that out with various stakeholders within their organization. I'd be really curious as a supply chain leader to see if my supplier, if my shipping department, if my legal team answers the questions the same way as everybody else, right? Because within one organization, different teams might feel, oh yes, we do that properly. Well, no, we don't. And so until you do this self-check, this stress test is what we call it, to see if you're running efficiently and compliantly, you won't really know. So depending on how you score, depending on the results across all of the units, the business units across your organization, you might need major help. Your organization might really need to lower their risk, or you might just need a brush up course or something. Or you can decide, listen, I can't do it anymore. Like we've talked about, the stress is too much. Let's automate as much as we can. Either way, E2Open can help with our software, our professional services, and training offerings.
Well, Gary, I think, at a minimum, I think, one of the key takeaways here is that companies really need to be thinking about doing these self-assessments to really understand where they are today and where these, opportunities are. And then really, I really like that point about, having multiple stakeholders,
Yeah,
take that assessment or provide their perspective, because this truly is a collaborative, cross-functional, process when you really think about it. And I think it should be something that more than just the trade compliance group should be, focusing on it and talking about, because ultimately that's where you're going to get that broader perspective and be able to see where the issues are perhaps, or see where the opportunities are to, be a leader in this area. Um,
sure.
well, Gary, again, always a pleasure having you on the program. You provided some great food for thought and some great advice for folks in this area, and certainly look forward to having you again on the program down the road to talk about what else is happening in this, crazy world that we're in, and particularly with global trade management and trade compliance. So thank you.
And thank you, Adrian. Always good to meet with you and your readers.
Great. I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the E2Open website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Gary, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.